How do you live up to that? Hi, everyone. Hi. I'm so happy to be here. I just came from a Stop the Ban abortion rally downtown, and I was in a very... my adrenaline was really pumped up, so I had to be like, oh, we got to go into another reality here. But I'm thrilled to be here tonight, and I love listening to everybody who's spoken before me. I want to begin with a little quote from Rainer Wilke, who said, "The future enters into us in order to transform itself within us long before it ever happens." And for many years, that was over my desk, and I knew why, but I didn't know why. And I want to tell two stories tonight that are connected to that, because I think, in a way, what he was really talking about was the imagination and the power of the imagination. And when I was a child, my stories are personal because the apology is the most personal and probably maybe the last personal thing I'm ever going to write in terms of it being about my life. But when I was a child, I lived in a constant state of torture and pain and threat and violence, and I was always scared. And I was very, very separated from my body because staying in my body just caused me so much anxiety and so much self-hatred. So early on, when my father, who was a tyrant, and by that point in my life he was an alcoholic and his moods would change like the currents, you know, and when he would get really, really, really bad, I would go into this other place in my head, and I found this creature, this character named Mr. Alligator, and he became my really good friend. And when my parents would shut me off or beat me up or do whatever my father did to me, I would go to the phone and I would call up Mr. Alligator. And I know this sounds like the childhood of someone really demented on some level, but bear with me. And I would say hi, and I would talk really, really loudly so my parents would overhear me. And I would say, "It's time for you to come. I think you have to come and get me." And I would pack my little bag, and I'd usually put crayons in it and an orange. And I'd take it out. And outside my house, we grew up literally in an upper middle class community, and there was literally a white picket fence around my house. All that external beauty disguising the internal hell. And I would walk myself down to the end of this little path, and I would sit there with my box and my little suitcase, and I would literally wait sometimes up to 6 hours for Mr. Alligator to come. And everyone would make fun of it, and everyone would demean me and say how crazy I was, and they didn't think it was cute. But for me, I knew that Mr. Alligator was coming. I knew it. I could see him. I could see him, and he was coming, and he was coming. And I actually never really got disappointed because it was a continuing story. Like he just hadn't arrived that day, but he was going to arrive. And this went on for a very long time. So cut to 40 years later, I'm in Kenya, and I'm doing research for a play I wrote called The Good Body, about women who are fixing their bodies all over the world and women who are not fixing their bodies. And I hear about this amazing woman named Agnes Pareo, who's in the Rift Valley. She's a Maasai woman, and she has been stopping the practice of female mutilation for a few years. And what she does, this is amazing, is she walks through the Rift Valley with a little suitcase, and inside her suitcase she has an anatomical figure, and it's of a vagina, and she goes to all the Maasai communities, and the Maasai are nomads, so they have these incredible shelters that they build out of cow dung, and when the cow dung collapses, then they move on to the next pasture. So she had walked through the Rift Valley with her box, with her anatomical structure, teaching Maasai families what a healthy vagina looked like and what a mutilated vagina looked like. And in the time she had walked, she had saved 1,500 girls from being cut. Amazing woman. So I had the fortune to sit in a classroom with her where she was teaching, and I was just blown away by her. And I said to her, "Agnes, what could V-Day," because we're a global movement that works in solidarity with grassroots leaders on the ground, I said, "What could we do for you?" And she said, well, Eve, if you got me a Jeep, I could get around a lot faster. So we bought her a Jeep. And in the first year, she saved 3 times as many girls. And so then I said, okay, Agnes, you're a superpower. What else do you need? She said, well, if you gave me money, we could build a house. Girls could run away. We could keep them because there's now a law in Kenya. We could educate them because obviously when girls were getting cut, they were no longer educated after that point and they were forced into marriage. She said, we can keep them, and then when their families are ready, we can reconcile them. So we gave her the money, and I went to Kenya. I went to Narok, this tiny little wonderful town. And when I drove up to the opening of the house, it was this sea of red, the colors of both the Maasai and V-Day. And there were all these girls dancing and singing, and it was just like the most beautiful scene I've ever. And there was a path, and I started to walk down the path with this amazing music and these girls dancing, and I went, oh my God, Mr. Alligator came. Oh my God, he's here. And it was just like, whoa, whoa. And at that moment, I realized the power of conjuring. I realized the power of attentive and focused imagination, what we can conjure up. And I think women had this power many, many, many eons ago. I think we knew how to conjure. And I think it's one of the reasons patriarchy evolved, because it was very powerful. I think men obviously have this power too, but I think women have it really big. So, cut to another story from my childhood. When I was younger, my father, every day of my life, told me I was bad, I was wrong, I was an idiot, I was stupid. And constantly, my obligation was to apologize for something, to the point where I would literally say, oh, I'm going to take a sip of water, I'm sorry. I'm going to go outside, I'm sorry. Oh, you're here, I'm sorry. To the point where my friends would say, I'm not going to be friends with you anymore because you're so sorry. You know, you have to stop saying it. And I was compulsively saying it. It was almost like I couldn't be on the earth if I didn't apologize for being here. So my father sexually abused me from the time I was 5 until the time I was 10. And then he turned, and he began to brutalize me and physically beat me, whip me, throw me against walls, give me bloody noses in restaurants until I left home at 18, almost murdering me a couple of times. All that time, I wrote him apology letters because I believed somehow that if I apologized hard enough, it would encourage him to do the same. That if I pushed him and I put it out there and I wrote it on the cardboard that he stuffed his shirts with, you know, from the dry cleaner, and I wrote it on little cards, and I wrote it on, you know, maybe he would get the idea of what an apology was, and he would understand that this was reciprocal. He didn't. My father died 31 years ago, and I was in the Congo in late summer, because we have an amazing revolutionary sanctuary there for women who have been radically abused and tortured in the war. And I was again listening to stories about women, which I have listened to now for over 21 years in 70 countries. And I was thinking to myself, I have heard stories from women about every possible way that they have been harmed. I've listened to the comfort women who were raped in camps by the Japanese in World War II, who have been waiting for 70 years for an apology. I've sat with women in Congo, and women in Haiti, and women in Bosnia, and women in Kosovo, and women, all these women across the planet have been waiting for an apology. They've broken the silence, they've told their stories, and then I started to think, have I ever heard a man give a thorough, authentic, public apology? Have you? Anyone here? I asked this everywhere. And it suddenly went, wow, wow. How is that possible? In 16,000 years of patriarchy, we have never heard a public apology. And then I thought to myself, I need to write one. I need to write one. And I need to write it from my father to me, because he didn't get the clue. And I'll tell you something. That process, which was another conjuring. I had to conjure up my father. I had to conjure up his pain. I had to conjure up his childhood. I had to conjure up the makings that went into creating a person who began as a gentle, tender boy and became a pedophile and a sadist. And that conjuring, for me, I have to say, was the deepest experience of my life. Because I realize we hold each other inside us. We hold our perpetrator inside us. Someone who has abused us, someone who has entered us, someone who's raped us, someone who's beat us. They enter us, and they live in us. And we're always in dialogue with them, whether we know it or not. And what I did in writing this book is I let my father speak to me. And I let him tell me his story. And I let him tell me his pain. And I then let him take responsibility for every single thing he had done, to write a detailed account, to tell me why he had done it, what his intentions were, why he had driven it to it. And then I asked him in this way that we connected in this conjuring to take accountability for it. And he did. And to make amends. And he did. And I'll tell you something. I realized in doing this book that the two greatest gifts we have on this planet are compassion and imagination. They are the gifts that make us human beings. And in this conjuring, this book arrived, this book happened. It was almost like I went into a trance state, and I have to tell you, for days, I did not know who was my father and who was me. I did not know who was writing this book, and I actually referred to it as my father wrote this book because I feel like he did. It's his language, it's his voice, he has vocabulary I actually didn't even know. But what's happening now, and I'm just going to end with this, is since the book's come out, it's the first time men have really called me to interview me in all my career. I mean, there's been a rare occasion, but because I wrote the vagina monologues and the good body and in the body, it's rare that I get invitations to talk to men, in journalists or on podcasts. And I realize what The Conjuring has done. It's opened men's hearts. And now men are starting to talk to me in a real way about how, when they were children, their tenderness got smashed like my father's. How when they wanted to be human and imperfect, and when they wanted to cry, or when they wanted to not know, or they didn't want the burden of being the perfect, adored one, they are opening their hearts to say what that did in terms of creating the person they became. I got an Instagram a few days ago from this beautiful man who told me that he heard me talk about tenderness, and that my father, because he couldn't feel tender towards himself or tender towards other things, had to destroy the tenderness I evoked in him and therefore destroy me. And he said he realized he'd never been tender to himself. And in order to be the man he wanted to be, he was going to learn how. I never got a letter like that before. So I feel like this process of conjuring and then entering and conjuring and entering is the work we're doing here as artists, but as human beings. So whoever's sitting next to you, and I really just want to say this, we're very traumatized people, particularly in the time of the predator-in-chief. And we're living in a time that is very, very, very hateful and painful. And I just feel we need to enter each other and feel each other and conjure each other and conjure a future that's possible for each other. Thank you all very much.